welcome to our Paranoid Fan Baseball Party. You guys all know Chuck Greenberg. I'm Jeff Skinwade of the Ben and Skin Show on 105.3 The Fan. And then our very esteemed guest of honor. You, if you're here, then you probably spent a lot of time reading the good stuff at grantland.com, and he's definitely one of the best writers there, doing great baseball work. We've had him on the Ben and Skin Show before. He's a great guest. Give it up for Mr. Jonah Keri.
When you say the good stuff on grantland.com, does that mean Zach Lowe's here? Because I can leave and we'll get Zach up.
We'll get Zach to come in here and power rank the Wookiees or something at some point. Okay, Jonah, so I want to start with you. And, you know, you're well known for being all over, you know, in the analytics community, but as well as having a good feel for financial situations of teams and how they're able to use, you know, analytics to their advantage, especially when you have the old free spending kinds of teams. And I think even those teams are trying to cut back and not do that as much. So the first thing I want to ask you is kind of how you started going down this trail in the first place and making that sort of, I don't know, a specialty for you and, like, you know, something that you were comfortable writing on and a big area of knowledge for you.
It was my background. I came out of college and I graduated in 97, and the only people that wrote about baseball online who were doing well with it and making a living were Rob Nyer, who's one of my closest friends now, and Bill Simmons, who's now my boss. And I was just like, this is the coolest. People could do that. Wow, that's great. But it wasn't. Those guys are outliers. They're incredible. And so I didn't want to have to be at the local paper and write high school field hockey for 40 years before I'd get a chance to do a sport that I wanted to do. So I figured I'll try something else. And so very young age, I was 23 or something, my first legitimate good job in journalism, I wrote for Investors Business Daily. And I did that for 11 years. This job at Grantland is my first full-time sports writing job that I've ever had. It was always a side gig. I was always a financial writer, and sports came after. I was a bigger sports fan. It wasn't that I had this passion for finance. It was an opportunity to have that job. So melding the two just became this kind of natural thing, I guess.
I think that's kind of like, you know, real indicative of sort of all the writers that kind of came up in the internet age. It's interesting. There's a lot of really good Ranger bloggers, and they all happen to be lawyers, too. Right? It's like you got Jamie Newberg and Adam, who doesn't even live in town, the Lone Star Ball guy, and Michael Heineman, and all these guys that are now sort of looked at as media figures, right? Like you know, Jamie's kind of a friend, but, you know, I think of him as a writer as much as I think of him as a lawyer or whatever. And I'm curious about, you know, as you're writing the stuff that you write and coming up and writing on the internet and things like that, it's kind of away from the old journalism style, right? Where you have to answer to certain things. And you have an editor going, all right, how many times have you fact-checked this? And how many sources do you have and all this stuff? It really is pretty wild and woolly era of internet journalism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for blogs, that's the case. I mean, things can go up right away. And there are different, some blogs have more editors, some blogs have a few editors, some blogs have no editors, whatever. Grantland, I mean, we're looking at it pretty heavily. The style is very freewheeling. But someone like Jamie, absolutely. And I think it creates this style of journalism where you could become complacent and you can kind of half-ass it. But what I find, I mean, I can speak to Jamie especially, and he's a friend of mine too. He works so hard at it. It's almost like he doubles down on the effort. He's like, I better not be wrong because I don't have anybody to fact check or whatever. So he's just so diligent in his work. And you could put Adam in there, and shutdown inning guys are here too. And just, I feel like they feel a higher responsibility, and some of these people, especially when they start off, might be making $0 from it, and they're going to treat it just as, in fact, I'm going to be honest, probably more professionally than a lot of highly compensated current sports writers in America. So
yeah, and it's a weird thing because I don't think Newberg sleeps. Like when does he practice law? When does he? I don't understand. It just seems like
he's got a lovely family. He's a good-looking guy. I don't really care for him. That's not.
What a jerk. What a jerk. Chuck, I want to involve you in the conversation here. And since we're kind of talking about, you know, from the journalism side of things, you know, in the last couple of years, I want to know how you kind of adapted to being, because I consider you a pretty media savvy kind of guy. You know, you do a good job dealing with the reporters and jumping on the shows and stuff. And when did you first kind of start, you know, coming from the background you came from, feeling comfortable doing that side of things?
Well, I was smiling when you were talking about how many people in the online community are lawyers, because that's my background too. Mm-hmm. I guess all of us are trying to escape, and I'm happy that I did.
Right.
But How it came about with me is I got involved in the sports industry pretty early in my career when I was introduced to Mario Lemieux, and through the relationship with Mario, got involved in a lot of things in the NHL, and that then moved into a lot of different sports and baseball, which was my first love, and started buying teams. Then, of course, that culminated with the Rangers. So a lot of what I did relatively early in my career was high-profile stuff where there was a significant exposure to the media. So between being able to observe a lot of people handle it, some well, some not so well, and then being thrust into that role a little bit myself, got some practice, got more experience with it, sort of off Broadway, if you will, with the minor league teams. And I remember in January of 10, when we signed the purchase agreement for the Rangers, it happened to coincide with a development camp that the Rangers were holding at the ballpark. And John Blake wanted to organize a Meet the Media thing. And I remember stepping out from the runway onto the field, and there's this huge, phalanx of reporters around him. Everything. This is just like Altoona, except times 10. So it's the same thing. It's just with more people and more ears.
Obviously, I would assume everyone here is a Ranger fan to some degree. I know there's probably just some straight baseball fans here, but I want to get your take on what just went down here in the last couple months with the Rangers.
What do you mean?
Well, there was this story, and this guy named Randy Galloway. No, what happened is I'm real curious as because this story really it dates back a ways, but in terms of being a public thing, I think everyone first becoming aware of it at the start of last spring training. As you watch this thing develop over the last 8 or 9 months, kind of what your thoughts were, and then when Nolan made his announcement here a couple weeks ago.
Well, obviously, whenever you see indications of internal, disharmony, dissension, whatever you want to call it, it's not ideal. But at the time that I was leaving the Rangers, I remember telling Ray Davis and Bob Simpson, who are terrific guys, and I think have been exemplary owners who've done a great job. They keep stepping up, whenever there's an opportunity to acquire players. I mean, they've really done the right thing, I think, all throughout. But I remember saying at that time that by far and away, John Daniels was more important to the franchise than either myself or Nolan. And I really believe that, because with JD, it's not just a guy. It's the whole department. It's the whole culture on the baseball side of things that's very enlightened, that I think melds the best of the old school scouting approach and the new age analytics. And I think that along with a number of other franchises, the Rangers are a role model. And JD and Thad Levine and AJ Preller and Mike Daly and the whole crew are the reason for that. And when you got a baseball department that's firing on all cylinders and works so well, you can't lose that, because if it was easy to build that, everyone would have it. And they're not just great at their job, but they're really good people. And the whole culture around them, where it's not a cult of personality and where everybody's in it together and everybody's opinion is respected, is a rare thing. And when you have it, you just can't let that go. So I'm sure it was a very difficult set of circumstances for ownership, but at the end of the day, the guy they couldn't lose, the leader they couldn't lose, was John Daniels. So while it's unfortunate that it played out this way, if there was going to be a change, I think it came out in the only way that made sense for the franchise.
And obviously you were a part of a big change that I think was shocking to all Ranger fans. I mean, it was certainly kind of, oh, wow, so this is out of left field. When you were going through all that, could you have imagined what happened here a month ago? I mean, was that something that you could even see back then, that maybe that fracture was coming?
Truthfully, yes. I did think that at some point, not too far down the road, something like this would play out. Again, it's unfortunate, but sometimes you can kind of see the signs, and sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. And so, no, I wasn't terribly surprised.
Would you? Do you think Nolan will ride off into the Nolan sunset, or a lot of people speculate he might be involved in the Astros despite his past with that ownership because his son is there? What do you kind of, if you were guessing, would happen with him?
I don't know. That's it's a great question. I've thought about it too. Reed Ryan is a really good friend of mine. Reed is the one who connected me with Nolan originally, and Reed and I continue to be great friends. We met extensively at the industry meetings in Louisville just about a month and a half ago, and at that point his dad hadn't left, but it was something that he and I chatted about a little bit. And I don't know. It'll be a fascinating situation. Obviously, the situation with the Rangers, the situation in Houston are not the same. Reed's role is not quite the same. Reed's a very talented guy. He's a great human being. I mean, a very positive person, very energetic, and It'll be fascinating to watch. It's the kind of thing it's fun to watch from the outside.
Yeah, it's fun, a nice baseball soap opera. I want to get Jonah in the mix on this because I want to get sort of the national perspective. It's interesting. For so long, the Rangers were not a national story. National writers were not writing about them. In fact, the article that you wrote a couple years back talking about how the TV deal was going to change things for the Rangers, it was like we weren't used to national media writing those sorts of stories about the Rangers. They became a big deal, and I think Nolan had something to do with that, and Chuck had something to do with that, and obviously their success. What was your perspective on what has gone down with the Rangers in the, let's say, even going back to last offseason, and the leaks of the stories about Nolan and JD maybe not seeing eye to eye, and then where we are here in the last couple of weeks?
I should preface this by saying that I wrote, a 5,000-word article about the last 25 years of the Milwaukee Brewers. I'm a crazy person. I'm not the normal barometer for the national media. Let's establish that. To me, this whole idea, I think that it became perceived a little bit as a new school versus old school thing.
Uh-huh.
I've only talked to Nolan Ryan twice at some length. Nolan Ryan isn't anti-stats or anti-progress or whatever. He's a really smart baseball man. I mean, even though his job is in an executive role, he brings something to the table from that perspective. And as Chuck said, this is an organization that absolutely comes at it from both angles. They have a great scouting department, a great one. So from my completely uninformed outsider perspective, everybody in this room could probably say it better than I could, but it seemed to me that it was about who was going to run the thing. It wasn't necessarily a style thing. It was just you couldn't have two factions. I guess you had to sort of work out what was going to happen. But it didn't strike me as if Nolan stays, the Rangers are going to be run this way, and if JD stays, they're going to be run this way. I think they would have been run well no matter what.
The interesting thing to me is, and there's knowledgeable people here in town that still want this narrative to play out of, well, it's this new style of baseball versus the old scouting style. What is describe to everyone what your perception is of John Daniels as a management style, as the way he views baseball, and new analytics versus old scouting and those sorts of things?
The first time I ever met John Daniels was an event hosted by Jamie Newberg, and it was like in 04 or 05. And John Daniels was 4 or 5 years old, I think, at the time. and he was John Hart's assistant. I mean, a really young, and he looks very young, even younger. And it was first time I ever met the guy, and it was in a bookstore, and it was like baseball prospectus related and all this stuff. And so he talked, and he wasn't a blabber. He would just say certain things, and everything that he said, it just struck me as, that's really interesting. And he has a business background. I mean, he came at it from that. So does Andrew Friedman. So do a lot of the new school guys.
Right.
And it struck me that to be someone who's successful in business, everything is about best practices. So it's everything. It's you're looking at the analytics, and you're looking at the scouting and everything. I have a friend named Dane Perry who writes for Fox. We used to work together at Baseball Prospectus. And the way that he describes baseball or stats and scouts is he says, do you like beer? Yes. Do you like tacos? Yes. What's the effing problem?
Right.
Why not both?
Right.
And that's John Daniels, man. He likes beer and tacos. I feel that the Rangers are run that way, I think. And they do a good job with everything. We were talking before we came up. I interviewed Jorge Vasquez at one point. He was the strength and conditioning coach. He isn't anymore. And he was teaching a specific kind of training method to the players, to the pitchers. And it was Nolan Ryan's idea that Nolan Ryan had always done sprints instead of distance running. Usually pitchers distance run to train. Vasquez was saying, do sprints, not distance running. Why? Because this is a sprint, not a marathon. I was like, that's brilliant. That's so innovative. I mean, I really hadn't heard, other than Nolan Ryan, I hadn't heard of that. To me, everybody that I met in the organization, Preller really is smart. You mentioned him. Scott Service, was he with the organization?
Not anymore.
He was at the time, and I liked him too. I just thought that Danny Clark is another one. And I was just impressed by everybody. And it really seems to me that this is a well-run organization. And I can't say for certain, but it seems to me that the idea of making sure that JD can do his thing or whatever is all about keeping that chain of command. And when I wrote about the Rays, when I wrote a book about the Rays, the biggest thing that stood out to me, not stats, not this, not that, not Madden specifically, it was that from Stu Sternberg, the owner, on down to the 22-year-old intern who's working there, everybody's on the same page. And the 22-year-old intern can go into Joe Madden's office now and say, start this guy, and Joe Madden will do it. Because he trusts him, because he knows that guy is an extension of Stu Sternberg, who's an extension of Matt Silverman and Andrew Friedman and all that. And I get the impression that the next iteration, and the Rangers are already well run, but I think the next iteration of the Rangers will look a lot like that Rays structure. Everybody's on the same page. Everybody's doing the same thing, and I think it's going to go really well. I would be very bullish, aside from having Profar and these cool players. If I were a Rangers fan, I'd be like, wow, this is a well-run franchise.
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting point about everybody being on the same page. And, Chuck, I'd like for you to weigh in on this because, John, he's a pretty guarded guy for the most part, but he speaks on that a lot about everybody pulling in the same direction. And this is ultimately what this was about. Was there somewhere along on the way there was a fracture of trust? And I'm always interested in this narrative. Well, JD's not a wash guy. It's like, oh my God, has anybody ever stood by a manager more than JD stood by Wash? And it's such an absurd storyline. When you were there and you were behind the scenes and all that, was that a difficult thing trying to get everybody to do a sort of we're heading in the same direction here? Could you see that different people had different ideas and maybe were feeling like, oh, I need to branch out and do my own thing?
Well, that was one of the things that I tried to do, was to be a little bit of a shock absorber and to help keep everybody together. But in fairness to everyone involved, it was a tough situation. If you go back to the bad old days before, before this great era of the last 4 or 5 years, JD was already the general manager. Rangers were in desperate financial straits. Tom Hicks brought Nolan in, who brought a tremendous amount of credibility, but to whom nobody really reported. And then over time, that changed to where then JD reported to him, and then some of the people on the business side reported to him. Then the team goes into bankruptcy. Then we purchase it. So then I come in, and so it was a constantly changing platform.
Right.
And that's not easy for anybody, and I mean, again, in fairness. So you didn't have a traditional situation where an owner comes in, hires his top guy like Stu Sternberg and Matt Silverman, who then hires Andrew Friedman. In other words, it didn't go in a single direction.
Right.
So you had all these different forces and all these different events at different times, and that's going to be a quilt or a stew more than something that's got perfect continuity. So it's understandable how it came to be this way, but it's also essential that in a way that isn't always pretty, that it gets worked through, and I think that has happened. And I agree with you. I think the Rangers are heading into much calmer waters in terms of the decision-making process, and armed with terrific baseball operation, tremendous farm system, which I get to see every day through our affiliation with the Rangers and via my ownership of the Myrtle Beach Pelicans.
Right.
And the television deal, which kind of changed the industry, which was probably the most significant thing that took place, on my watch as part of acquiring the team. There's no organization in baseball that's in better shape right now than the Rangers. Now, there's a lot of others who are on the metal platform with them, but in the short list of franchises that are perfectly positioned for the future, the Rangers are right there.
Okay, the TV deal is fascinating, and I do want to get to that in just a second. But before we do that, I want you to take us through Davis and Simpson getting in the picture, because one of the things that was really interesting is, first you, and then became Nolan, and it was like you guys were like the managing partner types, and so you would be representative at the owner meetings and those things. Well, now Ray Davis is stepping up into that role, and by a lot of accounts, it seems like that's going to be like a very new thing for him and his personality. How did they get into the mix, and how do you see that working out with them being more visible owners now?
Well, first of all, they're both really good guys who are both very smart, have been fabulously successful, and they've succeeded everything they've done. There's no reason to think that they won't here. I was introduced to them during the fall of '09. I had set up shop here in the summer of '09. I started looking at the Rangers at the beginning of May of 2009. I'll give the very, very abridged version of the story because everyone has to be home before dawn. So anyhow, So I first came down for my first meeting with Tom Hicks in May of '09, and in about 30 seconds thought this was just the perfect opportunity because it was a big market, loves its sports. I thought the Rangers were perfect because they'd been around 39 years, hadn't been very relevant for most of those 39 years, had a great farm system, fan expectations were really low, and the media deal was expiring. And it was like everything that I thought about for 4 or 5 years. And it must have been like, finding King Kong in the jungle. I thought this is perfect. So jumped into it full bore, working in putting a group together because I wasn't the kind of guy who was in a position to just write a check and buy the whole thing. But at the time, the finances around the Rangers were so screwed up that it had scared everybody off. I mean, there's as many people who can write a check to buy the Texas Rangers, or at least could at that time here, as buying, as any community in the country. But people have been scared because all the things they'd heard. So part of the hard part in meeting with people here was to get them past all the perceptions they had that was just too much of a mess. Now, I was the guy who'd helped put the deal together for Mario Lemieux to buy the Penguins out of bankruptcy a decade earlier, so I wasn't scared off by, by it being a cesspool, on the surface. So just kept working through it. And I spent a ton of time down here during the summer of '09 just kind of hanging out and talking to people. I mean, just going to bars and talking to cab drivers and, doing my own form of due diligence, which is just set up shop and talk to people and see what's really going on. And what was fascinating about that is everybody I talked to said that the Rangers would never make it. I mean, everybody. No one said, what a great idea. They'll draw $3 million and be one of the preeminent franchises. Everybody said they'd never make it. It was too hot. It was a football town. It wasn't a baseball town. No one pays attention once the Cowboys go to training camp. No one pays attention September. Women won't go because they don't want to sweat. I mean, it was just like every excuse you could possibly hear. And then they would tell me some really cool story about something they'd done with their uncle or their grandfather or their grandmother at a ball game years earlier. And what I heard were people who really loved baseball and they loved the Rangers, but they were afraid to care. It was like emotionally it wasn't safe to go in the water because they'd had their hearts broken. They felt totally disconnected from ownership. They didn't trust the franchise. And so they were just afraid to care. And I thought, with all these other things that are going for the franchise, potentially, if we could get control, do a bunch of things to win back the trust of the fans, this could be the kind of transformational experience like when the current ownership group of the Red Sox purchased them. Because I went to college in Boston, and 6 o'clock on a Tuesday night, you said, you want to go to Fenway? Sure. Where do you want to sit? Let's sit 5 rows behind home plate, and you could.
Right.
And then the new group got it and immediately transformed the way they were perceived in the community, and all of a sudden it was Red Sox Nation, and there was a wait list for season tickets. I thought, this is the kind of community where we could have that kind of transformational experience if we do things just right. So I made the decision by the time we got to the fall that I wanted this to be a local group. And, just really worked my tail off, to try to meet the right people and, gave a lot of different presentations and pitched my vision of how this was going to work. And the media deal was a huge part of it because I thought the media opportunity was enormous and it was essential too. And just going through the daisy chain of relationships and, the people that I'd met when I was just hanging out, eventually I got to meet Ray Davis and separately got to meet Bob Simpson. And it was pretty interesting. The day I met Bob Simpson, he kept having to leave the meeting and then come back, and he'd leave the meeting and come back. And it turns out it's because he was on the phone with the chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil cutting his deal to sell XTO to ExxonMobil. So he had some really big fish to fry that day. But Ray Davis I got signed on before Bob, and Ray's terrific and he's just a great human being and very stable and calming. But initially the two of them didn't even want anyone to know they were going to be in the group. In fact, when Tom Hicks selected us in December of '09, initially neither Bob nor Ray even wanted their name to be in the press release. And I said, look, we got to, you guys are the two biggest financial backers here, and it'd be kind of disingenuous to make it seem like Nolan and I are, each writing a check and that's it. So they agreed that it was okay for me to put their name in the press release, and obviously, the whole sports industry, it's a fishbowl, and more so now than ever before, and it's completely understandable that it's been an evolution for them to get comfortable with being more in the public eye. And as events have played out, it's become more necessary that they do that without becoming over-involved. So I think, in fairness, when you step back and you look at the hand that was dealt and how things went down, I think that the evolution of their role makes perfect sense. I think they've really handled themselves well. They've made the decisions that they've had to make when they were thrust upon them. And at the end of the day, you've got this great franchise that is at an all-time high in terms of fan approval, where you've got a tremendous baseball operation. You got a TV deal that outside of LA is the envy of the industry, and they're just they're in great shape.